Welcome to the live stream, everyone.
Yes. No, we are not going to do that. We are not going to do that. Source. We're going to go to camera. There we go. There it is. Okay. We are going to... Oh, we're already recording. Shoot. Okay.
Hey, you started the recording.
Okay, here we go. Here we go. Let's go here. I don't have to worry about that. There we go. Okay, but now I'm paranoid and I'm not sure it's recording.
It is.
It is recording. Okay.
It is.
Sorry, everyone. Okay, so let's talk about the differences between Underglaze and Glaze. Glaze, does anybody remember what I told you about glazing? Yeah. Can you wait till I'm done with this?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Nick.
Glazing is like unsure. You can't do details on it because
It fuses with whatever's around it. So drawing things with glaze, you can do it, but it looks very soft and out of focus. But some people like that vibe. So you can do it, but it can be kind of dangerous. And some glazes will drip more than others. So you're not always guaranteed to keep the image that you started with. So glazes do fuse together, okay? Soft edges. Underglazes are the opposite. You can get anything you want and they are opaque. When you layer glazes, they fuse together. So if you put a layer of black and then you put a layer of white and then you put a layer of purple, you're going to end up with some kind of grayed out purple. Does that make sense? Because they're all going to mix together and become one. With underglaze, because it's opaque, you can put 3 layers of black down, decide you hate it, and put like 3 layers of white down and totally disguise it. You will never know that black is underneath there if you do 3 levels. Next.
do you still need to do like? Is there a limit of the amount of layers you can do on underglaze? Like there's.
People say not to go too much. I have done like 10 to 12 layers with underglaze and been fine. But underglazes can be a little bit tricky and finicky. Now, one of the big things, let's just go next, we'll learn. Alright, underglaze is clay-based colored decorative coating. It is clay. It's colored clay. What is underglaze made out of?
Colored clay.
Colored clay. It's just dirt. That's why it's opaque. Have you seen any dirt lately that you can see through like a window? No, it's dirt. It's not see-through. Alright? So that's the big difference between glazes and underglazes. Anybody remember what glazes are made out of? Glass, like a window. Glass, like a window, is see-through to some degree, no matter what you do, okay? When you don't put clear glass on top of it, or clear glaze on top of it, it fires matte. But when you fire it like this, it looks cool, but it's not water or dust proof. So you always kind of want to cover it, if that makes sense. Next. Glaze is liquid glass. Everybody follow? It's colored glass. It's applied and it has a watertight glossy finish. Now clay itself at low fire range, which is what we're at, it will never vitrify, which means it's never going to become a waterproof entity. So our clay, after you fire it, if you put it into a bowl of water, it will soak up all that water. Does that make sense? So in order to make our clay, because we're not firing it at really high temperatures, you get clay that goes high fire or even mid fire, your clay will vitrify, which means it will just naturally become waterproof, which is really cool when you think about the chemistry of it all that I don't really understand. But for us, we're doing low fire, so it's really important for our work, especially if we're going to drink out of it or put it in water, that we cover it in glaze, which will create this waterproof coating. Yes?
Why haven't you put like plants in it or something?
Plants, actually, it's good to not have something that is watertight with plants. Some plants, depending on what kind of plant.
Okay, so when did you put like glaze on the outside and on the inside and put plants?
Yeah, you could do that, yeah. You
Well,
can put
like-
glaze on the inside as well, but you want to have a hole on the bottom to drain.
Yeah, that's the thing, is then the water gets in and it starts
Yeah.
being mold and
Exactly. Next. Alright, so if you look here, these are 2 pieces that I've made. I gave that one actually to Mr. Hopkins. This one right here is done with underglaze. It is
Fancy.
porous, which means it soaks up liquid. It is matte. So this actually has a glaze on top of it. It's actually a matte glaze. But you can see on the test tiles, everybody see the test tiles over here? Where the top here has no glaze on it. Okay? The bottom, it looks darker and glossier. That has clear gloss glaze on it. So you can see what happens to the color when you put glaze on it. It's much darker. Just kind of a mind trip. It's really difficult with underglaze to get the color you want because you have no idea until you fire it and put some glaze on it what it's going to look like. It's a very stressful situation, okay? It is not waterproof. It's also not Seder proof, but it's definitely not waterproof, okay? Glaze, it is harder and stronger. That layer of glass does make your piece stronger, okay? It is glossy. It has a layer of glass on it, and it is waterproof. Okay, next. This is clear gloss glaze. It is a see-through glaze. So we have two different types, and you can see the jugs up behind Miss Wilson. There is a pink jug and a white jug. The pink jug, you'll never use those. I always pour those into smaller containers for you. The pink is the clear gloss. It will turn out glossy. The white is a clear matte. It turns out more like a satin finish. So you can see here are two pots. This one is a gloss finish. This doesn't have clear on it. It's just I think it's spring green. But see how shiny it is in the light? This one is a matte gloss, or a matte finish, or glaze. It's a matte glaze. So see how it's way less shiny? I like the matte better, but it is one of the most temperamental glazes that we have. It wants to, if you put it on even just a little bit too thick, instead of being clear, it fires white, which is really upsetting. Can I get everybody's heads up, pretty please? Everybody's heads up. True. Would you kick his chair for me? Or just shove his chair?
I got this.
Earthquake him. No, you do it. Quickly. Oh dear.
Yeah, that was worth a shot.
Stand up.
Want me to go get some
Okay,
water?
Okay, here we go. Next. All right, here's the deal. All glazes, how many coats do you need for it to turn into glaze?
3.
3. I will tell you that the clear gloss glaze, the pink one, it's on the thin side. It's a very runny glaze. So I like doing 4 layers. And each layer, what do they have to do before you put the next layer on?
Dry.
It has to dry. If you don't, this is what happens. See this one? These are 2 abstract sculptures. You can't really tell what they're going to be because they're covered in clear glaze. But see how there's areas where you can see the green through the pink? If yours looks like that, that means you need another coat. Because this glaze, just this glaze, is very finicky and thin. It's actually a great glaze, but it tends to be thin. This one, you can't see any of the color underneath there. It looks totally pink. That one did great. Yes?
If you were to put like a colored glaze over underglaze, would it like completely erase underglaze?
It wouldn't erase it. It would influence it.
But also
So
bubble.
if you look at these test tiles down here, I have a black corner on all of them. But imagine you could put pink underglaze underneath this green, and it would probably look some kind of brown because pink and green make brown. So you can. So if it's a thinner glaze like this one, see how much you can see of the black right there? It does make it look like a dark green. Does that make sense? The underglaze will, you can put a color glaze on top, it will influence what it's going to look like. But that is very also like exploratory. You know what I mean? Like I don't have a test tile for every single color. We have thousands of test tiles lining all the walls. Next. So matte glaze is see-through. This is actually just, and some of our test tiles are matte glazes. Like the pink is matte, the terracotta and the tangerine are matte, and there's also a white and a black that is matte. So we have a gloss and a matte version of black. But the clear one will turn out kind of like that vase I showed you that is not glossy. You want to apply evenly. And like I said, if you put the matte clear on too thick, it doesn't turn see-through, it's white. Which is kind of a bummer. I learned that the hard way. True. Would you stand up, please, by the trash can? Thank you. Next. All right, these are the test tiles. Everybody look at your picture that you have I put in front of you. You have a picture of all of these test tiles. I have some new test tiles since I've taken this picture, so you can also take a picture of the ones that we have and don't have. Also, at the time that I made these test tiles, you can see on the clear gloss and the clear matte that we were using orange clay at the time, okay? So our colors are a little bit different on white clay. But test tiles are really important so that you can see what it's gonna look like. You will see that with Underglaze, it really, really changes how it looks when it's wet versus how it looks when it's dry versus how it looks after it's been fired versus how it looks after you've clear glazed it. It changes and looks different at every one of those stages. It's very, very difficult to keep track of. Next. At the bottom, this is right below the test tiles in real life, but I also have given you a picture of it. It shows you how I've made each of these test tiles and what's been done. So if you look here, Underglaze is colored liquid clay. It only goes underneath glazes. Its literal name is Underglaze. You never want to put glaze on top of, Underglaze on top of glaze. You get a chemical reaction. All of the toxins in the clay wants to come out in the firing, and so it doesn't do well. You either get crawling or you get bubbles that turn into shards. Okay, and I showed you guys some of that before, right? It can go on greenware or bisqueware, so before it's been fired or after it's been fired. You guys are not allowed to put it on greenware because we do sculptures with really little fine pieces, and when your piece is bone dry, it's super, super fragile. Does that make sense? So we only ever do that with pottery because pottery is a lot harder to break. It's predictable like paints. You can mix it just like paints. It will not bleed or fuse. It has sharp edgework. It is not dust or waterproof, and it must be fired before putting on top of the glaze. So like I said, if you put 3 coats of underglaze on, which you also need 3 coats to make it work, you cannot immediately put glaze on it. You have to fire it in between. So you have 1 fire to make it bisqueware, you have 1 fire for the underglaze, and then you have a 3rd firing for the glaze that you put on top of it. So if you're going to do a piece with underglaze, it has to go through a total of 3 kiln firings. Does that make sense to everybody? So let's see how this test tile was made. The first thing I did is I made it out of clay and I bisfired it. It got hard, right? It's now ceramic. Step 2, I covered it with 3 layers of amethyst underglaze. Step 3, I glaze fired it in the kiln. And now before you fire it, you'd be able to wash that purple off. After you fire it, it's permanent. You cannot wash it off. It is now one with the clay during that firing. After that, I covered half of it with 3 coats of clear gloss glaze. And then step 5 is I fired it, and it is now finished. So half of our tiles have glaze on them, and half of it doesn't, so that you can tell what they look like in those 2 different situations. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, with the with the glaze test tiles, it goes only on bisqueware. You cannot put glaze on greenware. If something has never been fired before, it tends to run the risk of explosion or cracking. And if your piece explodes or cracks with glaze on it, it's going to stick to everything it touches in the kiln. It's like a dynamite in the kiln that is putting everybody else's piece at risk. Does that make sense? So we only ever do it after it's been bis-fired. Yes?
So is greenware just like not good?
Yes, greenware is bone dry clay. Clay that's in the shape that you want it, but it just hasn't been in the firing yet.
Okay.
Yeah. It's unpredictable when mixing. You don't know how that's gonna look, and it's not gonna look the same everywhere. It drips and bleeds and has fuzzy edges. Its layered glazes will fuse together, so if you put 2 colors on top of each other, they're gonna mix to turn into something other. And no glaze is allowed on the bottom of your piece. Why isn't glaze allowed on the bottom of your piece? You guys remember? Nick? It's gonna stick to the kiln shelf. So, to make this test tile right here, I made the tile and I fired it to make it into ceramic. Second thing I did was I covered it with 3 layers of white underglaze, and on ours I also did 3 layers of a black corner on ours over there. And then step 3, I fired that, so the underglaze is now permanent. Everybody follow it? Then when it came out, instead of putting clear on it, I put aquamarine. I put 3 layers of aquamarine on there. And then step 5 is I actually put it through the firing, and now I have an aquamarine test tile. So if you look here, aquamarine looks wildly different on orange clay than it does on white underglaze. See how different that looks? We don't have orange clay, but imagine if you put a dark brown underglaze underneath aquamarine, you'd end up with something that looks similar to this.
You said glaze drips, right?
Yes.
So if you
More
put,
likely to, yes.
Yeah, so what if you put like glaze on the sides and then it drips onto the, and like gets stuck?
We have to break it off the kiln and then grind it down. Our kiln temperatures don't get so hot that usually happens. The only glaze that I've had that does that, where it drips off your piece, is golden aspen. It's one of our prettiest glazes. But if you put it on, I would not put more than 3 coats of that on, because if you put more than 3 coats of it on there, it wants to drip and attach. So just beware of golden aspen. It's beautiful, but 3 coats only. Please, no more than 3 coats with that one. See how all of these glazes have different personalities? You get to know them after time. Next. Alright, so on this one, reconstituting underglazes and glazes. How many of you guys helped reconstituting the glazes? Remember, we poured them, we added water if we needed to, we sieved them, strained them, made them liquid again, blended them, beat them, all that jazz. This is very, very important, okay? With underglaze, it's a lot easier because you don't usually pour underglaze, you usually paint underglaze, so we don't have to worry about chunks. So if you see chunks in the underglaze, just avoid the chunks. You know what I mean? Just ignore those. Keep painting. The other beautiful thing that I love about underglaze is that if you let it dry out completely, you just have to submerge it in some water and it's totally fine. Totally fine. I love to use underglaze because all day long I'll be painting, but kids will interrupt me. But it doesn't bother me because I don't ruin my underglazes. I can just keep spraying them with water and reviving them. This is really the thickness that you want your glazes, which is kind of like pancake batter. It's enough to coat your hand or a finger if you want to test it. If it's thicker than that, you really don't want to do the pouring. Does that make sense? Because it goes on so thick. So if it's much thicker than this, then you really want to use a brush to apply it. Next.
Oh God!
Yeah, here are underglazes. And underglazes you can pre-mix, and you can mix wet on wet like you would with paints. Have any of you ever painted with 2 different colors of paints before and mixed it? You can really do that with underglazes. The hard part is that underglazes dry super, super, super fast. So it's hard to work wet on wet. It's more about layering, I would say. Next. This is a glaze white and a blue glaze next to each other. And see how they bleed into each other like that? So that's why you don't want to draw like a bunch of really small, delicate things because it'll fuse and bleed. Some colors more than others. Some colors less so. So it's kind of in between. I have one student, Sadie, who actually did a test. She did some really beautiful work. Did you guys see it? It was back there. It was all these hand-drawn painted eye flowers. That was all done with glaze, and it came out very soft. Next. All right, so we've talked about using brushes to apply. You can create kind of a texture. Next. You can use sponges to apply that kind of a texture. There's all kinds of natural sponges. You can also use the yellow ones that we like. Next. You can pour. If you're gonna pour, use a funnel to pour it back in if you don't have a wide opening so that you don't make a mess everywhere. Next. All right, so here's a great example of 2 things. Number 1, see how white the skin is, but in some areas you can see the white clay that looks more beige. This person did not put 3 layers of white on and or didn't wait for each layer to dry, so it's splotchy. Not good craftsmanship. Now notice that when they were painting the blue bathing suit, that it got some on the arm. See how they painted some of the arm? But I can tell that they tried to cover it up because it's much lighter, but they didn't cover it up using 3 coats. They only did 1 coat. So even when you're doing a patch-up job, you have to use 3 coats for it to be opaque and not see-through. Everybody follow me on that? Okay, next. This is what happens when your piece drips and it gets stuck to your film shelf. You can see that this is a different one over here, but you can see the one back behind it that it's really totally ruined the shelf. And you'd have to, we'd probably just end up throwing that away because there's so many ways you could get sliced up. I can't send things home that are gonna make people bleed. Next. So you have to really make sure to sponge off any part of your sculptures or your pots, whatever you're building, Yeah, anything that's gonna touch the kiln shelf has to be glaze free. How many of you not noticed that the glazes leave, like they kind of stain the bottom? That's okay. As long as it's not thick, it won't turn to glass. Next. Alright, this is a glazing journal. I gave you guys some of these pages. Some of yours say glazing journal. Some of them just look like the back without the title. That's totally fine. So this is not for a grade for Ceramics 1. I'm only going to grade upper level kids. But if you want to draw out what you're making, like you would draw out your piece and then you would put down below what glazes or underglazes you used and how many coats and what kind of application. So on here it asks for number of coats, any notes that you want to put, and you do this in order so that you know what your order was, because this way we can learn from each other to learn how you got a really cool technique. Yeah, Josh. I'm almost done. Next. Alright, so for firing an underglaze, you will first fire the bisqueware, then you will fire the underglaze, and then you will fire the clear glaze. 3 firings. Next. So what decoration technique would a ceramicist use if they desired hard, clean edges? Would they use glaze or underglaze?
Under.
They would use underglaze. Okay, and that is it. Thank you guys for your complete attention. Who asked to go to the bathroom first? Was it Zala? No, it was, yeah, you can go ahead and go. Thank you, my dear.
I always thought you knew my voice could go that high.
Okay,